Welcome to Thread of Terror. We bring you the creepiest stories from Reddit. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and hit subscribe so you never miss a scare. Story 1. The Shadow in the Barracks.
When I was 17, I joined the United States Army and was sent to southern Georgia for basic training and infantry school. At that time, the base was entirely dedicated to combat arms training, infantry school, airborne school, and ranger school. It was a secluded environment, almost exclusively occupied by male soldiers. Near the end of my training, I fractured both of my shins and was given 3 choices: a medical discharge, transitioning to a non-combat role, or joining the physical therapy and rehabilitation program to heal and try again. I chose the last option. On this part of the base, we still had to perform firewatch, a nighttime duty where 2 soldiers, one stationed at the door and the other patrolling, stood guard to ensure safety. One night, my assigned hour fell between 2 and 3 in the morning. My bunkmate took the door while I roved through the darkened barracks. At the farthest end of the room, there was a corner that was always unsettling, even in daylight. As I approached it, an unnatural darkness filled the space, dense, heavy, and almost alive. A chilling realization overcame me. Something was watching me. My body reacted before my mind could process it. Every step forward felt like walking against an invisible pull, a force that sent waves of dread through me. I could not see it, but I felt its presence, something unnatural, aware, and deeply wrong. My instincts screamed at me to turn back. I forced myself to retreat, never breaking eye contact with that void-like space until I reached my bunkmate. Just as I steadied myself, a soft voice called from outside the door. Da da dai. We froze. It was impossible. No children lived on the base, especially not awake at this hour. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" He nodded. Against every instinct, I reached for the door handle. We counted 1, 2, 3, and yanked the door open. Nothing, just an empty field. Before we could speak, the silence was shattered by laughter, a child's laughter, but twisted, filled with something unnatural. It surrounded us, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. My bunkmate's eyes widened in terror, mirroring my own. We locked the door. We stood in silence for the rest of our shift, never speaking of it again. But I wonder, wherever he is now, does it still haunt him too?
Story 2. The Crying in the Graveyard.
It was dusk when I found myself near the abandoned plantation house, a mile from my home. It was an eerie, stereotypical southern estate, its green paint faded, shutters hanging loose, as if whispering forgotten secrets. My grandparents' friend owned the land, which also housed an old graveyard, its newest tombstone dating back to the 1930s. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. As I stood there, a sudden chilling sound echoed through the air, a baby crying. The wailing was distant at first, but it carried an unnatural weight, as though the sorrow of ages clung to every note. My blood ran cold as I turned, scanning the dimming landscape. That was when I saw her. A girl, grey in complexion, stood just beyond the graves. Her dress was simple, worn, like those once worn by house servants in centuries past. She cradled a baby in her arms, gently rocking it. But there was something deeply wrong about her. Her form was not entirely solid, and her eyes, they were dark voids, hollow and empty, yet filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pull at my very soul. She did not acknowledge me, did not stop. She simply walked toward the trees, vanishing into the shadows as if she had never been there at all. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Fear clawed at my chest, my breath shallow as I forced myself to move, finally tearing away from the graveyard and hurrying home. I never spoke of it. Over time, the memory faded, buried beneath the ordinary moments of life. But then, curiosity got the better of me. Recently, I searched for the plantation's history and uncovered something chilling. In 1832, tragedy struck. An entire family perished when the wife, overcome with madness, locked the doors and set the house ablaze. 11 house servants died in the fire, 3 of whom were teenage girls. A cold realization settled over me. Had I seen one of them that night? Was she still searching for something lost in the flames of the past? I no longer walked near that land after sunset.
Story 3. The Cursed Land of Parichaney.
Parichaney was once a thriving town, but now it is nothing more than an eerie, overgrown graveyard swallowed by the forest. Its streets are gone, its houses have rotted away, and all that remains are the whispered stories of those who claim to have seen something unnatural lurking among the trees. I first heard about the Witch of Parichaney from an old local who warned me never to set foot there after dark. He spoke of a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s, banished to the outskirts of town, where she cursed Parichaney with her final breath. Soon after, sickness swept through, nearly wiping out the entire population. The town was abandoned, and all that remained were unmarked graves and shadows that never seemed to move with the wind. Curiosity got the better of me. One evening, just before dusk, I drove out to the cemetery. The moment I stepped out of my car, an unnatural silence blanketed the area. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. As I walked among the moss-covered graves, I noticed one marked only with a crude weathered stone. It was said to belong to the witch herself. Then I heard it, a faint, distant laughter. A woman's voice carried on the wind, yet there was no wind at all. My skin prickled as I turned, only to see a figure at the edge of the tree line. She was draped in a tattered black dress, her face obscured by the growing darkness. My breath caught in my throat. She raised an arm and pointed directly at me. Suddenly, the air grew thick, suffocating. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the ground, twisting toward me. The laughter grew louder, turning into a distorted, echoing wail. I ran. I did not look back. As I reached my car, the engine refused to start. Then a whisper came from just outside the driver's window. "You should not be here." The next thing I remember is waking up at home, my shoes caked in mud. I do not recall driving back, but I know one thing for certain: Parichaney is not abandoned. Something still lingers there, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter its domain.
Story 4. The Ghost That Hates the Bible.
A few years ago, I woke up in the middle of the night to see a strange afterimage, a glowing, vibrating outline in the shape of a hand. Instinctively, I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and blinked. The afterimage disappeared, but then I saw her, in the far right corner of my bed. A woman sat with her legs folded, unmoving. She looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Long black hair, pale skin, but unlike the common depictions, her face was fully visible, and her eyes glowed an unnatural white. She stared directly at me, her gaze burning into my soul. A strange calmness settled over me, as if my mind had not fully processed the terror before me. Acting purely on instinct, I began reciting a verse from the Bible. The reaction was immediate. The woman clamped her hands over her ears, tilted her head back, and opened her mouth as if screaming, yet no sound came out. Her entire form flickered, like a weak signal on an old television, and then she simply faded away. At the time, I brushed it off as sleep paralysis, but something about it never made sense. I had been able to move freely, something that should not happen with classic sleep paralysis. Then my younger sister shared something chilling. She had seen the same woman. One night, she woke up to find the figure crawling towards her from the far end of our bunk bed. When she shut her eyes tightly and reopened them, the woman had vanished. As if that was not unsettling enough, my mother later admitted that she too had glimpsed a shadowy woman standing in the living room corner for a brief second before she disappeared. But that was not the only presence in our home. A year earlier, I had seen the silhouette of a little girl with a ponytail running at the end of the hallway in the middle of the night. Another time, I spotted a tall, shadowy figure standing in my bedroom doorway before gliding away. We live in Germany, on land that has witnessed war, loss, and unimaginable suffering. Could these spirits be remnants of the past, or something far worse? Whatever the truth is, I do not think we were ever alone in that house.
Story 5. The Footsteps That Vanished.
Winter in Kashmir is unlike anything else. The snow falls endlessly, burying the world in silence, making it feel as if time itself has stopped. I was traveling to a remote village, though I can no longer remember why. Work? Adventure? It does not matter anymore. What I do remember is the cold, merciless, biting deep into my bones, and the eerie stillness of the landscape. That was when I found the house. It was old, abandoned, but standing strong against the storm. I had no choice. The cold would have taken me if I had stayed outside. As I stepped inside, a strange metallic scent lingered in the air. I told myself it was just old wood, damp and rotting, but something about it felt wrong. For a while the fire was my only comfort. The storm raged outside, but I was safe, or so I thought. That was until I noticed the shadow. It flickered against the wall, just beyond the firelight, unmoving, watching. My heartbeat quickened, but I dismissed it as a trick of the flames. Then the footsteps started, not outside, but inside the house. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. When I turned to look, the room was empty. Just me, just my imagination. Needing air, I stepped outside. That was when I saw them, footprints in the freshly fallen snow. They were not mine. The prints led away from the house into the trees, but they did not continue. They just stopped. No return prints, no sign of where the person or thing had gone, as if it had simply vanished into the air. Panic clawed at me. I rushed back inside, locking the door. The fire flickered violently, and then in an instant it died, plunging the room into darkness. A whisper brushed against my ear, cold as ice. It said my name. How did it know my name? I ran. I did not stop. I did not look back. Even now, I do not know what was in that house or what called my name in the dark. But if you ever find yourself alone in the snow and you feel unseen eyes upon you, do not stay. Just run.
Story 6. Barking at Shadows.
I once lived in an old run-down house that I'm convinced was haunted. I never saw a ghost, but I had a puppy who behaved as if someone else was constantly lurking around. It was a one-story house, unkempt and eerie, but it was my first time living alone, and I was working in a small town. Most landlords didn't allow pets, but one did. So, I tolerated the house for the chance to have a dog. He was a shy Labrador mix, reserved and wary of people, likely due to abuse, but he warmed up to me quickly. Then, there were 3 terrifying instances I'll never forget. One night, I was sitting in my chair watching television while my dog chewed on a rawhide bone at my feet. The house was designed in an open concept A-shape, kitchen leading to the dining room, and then the living room. Suddenly, my dog stopped chewing and stared into the dining room. He began growling, low at first, then louder and more intense. I froze, unsure of what he was seeing, trying to calm him down. After a few tense moments, he stopped and went back to chewing. I told myself it was just his odd personality. The second event was late at night. I woke to the sound of my dog pacing and growling beside my bed. I told him to lie down, but then I heard him drop something, a rope toy. I was confused. I never let him bring toys into the bedroom. He had no interest in the rope toy unless someone was playing tug of war with him. But there I was, wide awake, listening to him growl at nothing. The final incident was the worst. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I let my dog outside. Suddenly, I heard him barking loudly. Thinking there was another dog outside, I went to the dining room window. When I pulled back the curtains, I gasped. My dog was standing at the window, staring back at me with his ears perked and fur bristling. He stopped barking, glanced up at me, and then looked to the right, as if someone was standing there. My heart raced. I whipped around, expecting to see someone in the house, but the room was empty. Shaking, I rushed to the kitchen with a frying pan in hand, ready to confront an intruder, but no one was there. I let my dog in, and he froze, staring into the kitchen for a few moments. Then, with a sigh, he lay down, as though nothing had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that house. The dog had never acted this way before, and he never did again. The next day, I started searching for a new place to live, and we moved a month later. There were logical explanations, but I couldn't deny what I felt in my bones. That house was haunted.
Story 7. The Disembodied Arm.
I've always been there for my little Ahijado, godson. Since the day he was born, I've watched over him like an older uncle, helping him whenever he needed guidance or support. Yesterday, he sent me a picture of something strange, a haunting moment that shook him to his core. He had reached out for help, but no one seemed to take him seriously. Ty, on the other hand, believed in the supernatural and knew he was in distress. He called me today, his voice trembling with fear. He told me about an unsettling experience that happened the night before. Around 11 p.m., he had fallen asleep early. He was suddenly awakened by a voice whispering directly into his ear, "Ten cuidado," which means "be careful" in Spanish. His heart raced as he opened his eyes to the pitch-black room. He could feel a heavy, oppressive presence, as though something was lurking in the shadows, watching him. Frightened, he grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the darkness. When the picture came through, my blood ran cold. There, on the edge of his bed, was the unmistakable outline of a disembodied skeletal arm, reaching towards him from the darkness. No one else was in the room. He was alone. The image was terrifying. The skeletal arm seemed to reach out with malicious intent, frozen in time in a place where no arm should be. My poor Ahijado, a simple baker in a small Miami pastry shop, had never experienced anything like this before. He had no history of drug use or strange behavior, and his life was as normal as any young man's could be. But now, he was deeply afraid. I've tried to search for answers, but I found little. There are some mentions in European folklore of disembodied arms appearing as warnings, but nothing that could explain what happened to him. All I know is that my Ahijado is scared, and I need to find a way to protect him from whatever malevolent force is haunting him.
Story 8. A terrifying encounter at Tenpenny Bridge.
When my sister was 16 and I was 14, we lived in a small town in Indiana. Back in the early 2000s when we were in high school, there wasn't much to do except make our own fun. My sister and I were always close, and we had plenty of mischievous adventures together. One evening we decided to explore some local haunted spots, which we found on the internet, and we were determined to check them out the next night with our friends Samantha and Steve. armed with only an Ouija board, flashlights, and 10 pennies, we set off for a night of ghost hunting. The 10 pennies were meant for a specific place. Tenpenny Bridge, a legendary spot that was said to be haunted by the ghost of a man who died there, possibly with only 10 pennies to his name. According to local folklore, if you parked in the middle of the bridge, turned off your car, and placed the pennies in a neat row on the guardrail, strange things would happen. That night, we found Tenpenny Bridge after a long drive through the pitch-black countryside. We stopped, turned off the car, and set the 10 pennies on the concrete guardrail in a neat line. As we wandered about, joking and talking, we didn't think much of it. But then something strange happened. Steve noticed that the 2 pennies at the far right of the line had moved an inch. We brushed it off as nothing, but we decided to place the pennies back in their original position and wait. After 5 minutes, we stood around the car, laughing and talking. That's when it happened. A penny flew through the air, spinning and landing on the pavement between me and Steve. We froze in terror. We rushed over to the pennies, and what we saw made our blood run cold. The pennies were arranged like a heart monitor, some on the edge of the guardrail, barely hanging on. The sense of dread was suffocating. Panicked, we all scrambled into the car. My sister tried to start the engine, but it stalled 3 times. When the car finally started, we sped off, hearts pounding. After 2 miles, we stopped to collect ourselves. But my sister, still shaken, suggested we go back. We returned to the bridge, and to our horror, the 10 pennies were perfectly lined up again. We left quickly, only to find that each of us had woken up with a penny under our pillows the next morning. More than 20 years later, my sister and I still remember the chilling night at Tenpenny Bridge.
Story 9. The Shadows of the 1800s Church.
It was a chilling night, around midnight, when I was about 12 or 13. I am 27 now, and I still remember the fear that crept over me that night. My father, who worked as a driver, had to drop someone off at a church built in the 1800s. It wasn't just any church. This one was old, dark, and haunting, with a strange atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. We had been with him, my siblings and I, as he worked security there overnight to prevent anyone from trying to steal anything. The church was massive, a towering 4-story building with ancient portraits hanging along the walls, their eyes seeming to follow you as you moved. It was exactly the type of place you would expect in a horror movie. As a joke, I had asked one of the staff if the place was haunted, to which he chuckled nervously and said, "Yes, but don't tell anyone, especially not the kids." He went on to mention that there was a lot of activity in the basement, but we didn't think much of it at the time. The tour went smoothly, until the very end, when my dad was signing the guest book and chatting with the staff member. I was standing alone, waiting for them to finish. That's when I noticed something strange. Down the sanctuary hallway, I saw what looked like shadow figures, moving in the darkness of the sanctuary. It was dimly lit in the hallway, but the sanctuary was pitch black. These figures, tall and dark as silhouettes, walked aimlessly. Some seemed to glide through the air, while others moved in a slow, deliberate pace. I froze. One of the shadows even waved at me. My heart raced as I blinked, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again, they were still there, moving across the empty room. I turned my back for a moment, hoping to dismiss it. But when I turned back, the figures were still there. My mind raced, wondering if I was losing it. As an adult now, I believe it was residual energy, echoes of spirits trapped in time. The experience left me rattled, and I never looked at that church the same way again. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was a place where something far darker lingered.
Story 10. Loud cracks and ghostly warnings.
I live alone on the third floor of an old apartment building in New York City. One evening I was sitting on my couch watching television when suddenly an ear-splitting crack pierced the silence. It was so loud, it felt like it could tear my eardrums. It sounded like an electrical short circuit, but there was no burning smell or smoke, and all the electronics seemed to be working fine. With my heart racing, I immediately texted my downstairs neighbor to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. She replied, saying the noise sounded like something heavy had crashed onto her floor from above. Despite the fact that I live on the other side of the building, I was completely unnerved. I started searching the apartment for any sign of what could have caused the noise, but I found nothing. The sound had come from nowhere. Just then, my fiancée came home. She walked into the room and noticed a strange sensation in the air, as if the room were filled with static electricity. Her hair was standing on end, and it reminded me of what people say right before being struck by lightning. Earlier that same morning, she had witnessed something even stranger. A roll of aluminum foil had been thrown off the shelf and onto the floor by itself. And about a month ago, a photo of my late father and uncle, who had passed away 4 years ago, had mysteriously fallen off the shelf and cracked. It wasn't in a position where it could easily fall, yet it happened without explanation. Now I'm starting to wonder if all these occurrences are connected. The loud crack, the foil, the falling picture, they all feel like a message. The only thing that makes sense is that my uncle's ghost might be trying to get my attention, possibly because he doesn't approve of my aunt's new boyfriend. It's as if he's trying to send a warning. Could this all be a sign of paranormal activity? Or should I call an inspector to check the apartment's wiring? There's only one thing I know for sure. Something is not right.
Thanks for joining us on this terrifying adventure. If tonight's story gave you chills, let us know in the comments below and share your own scary experiences too. Don't forget to leave a like if you want more nightmares and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, sleep tight and remember, not all shadows are empty.